The smell of smoke woke me before dawn. I rushed outside only to see orange flames tearing through my wooden cabin resort. The place I had built with my own hands. The place where families came to escape the world. My heart sank as the fire swallowed years of work and memories. The firefighters tried, but it was too late. Every cabin was reduced to blackened rubble. Neighbors whispered it was no accident. The HOA had been furious after I refused to sell them the land for their new luxury project. They wanted control, but I had stood my ground, and now my dream was ashes. Everyone thought I'd give up, but I didn't. Instead, I started digging into the HOA secrets. What I found buried inside their budget records would turn the tables and leave every smug board member pale with fear when the truth came out. Asterisk. The smell of smoke clung to the morning air before I even opened my eyes. It was sharp, bitter, and wrong. At first, half asleep, I thought maybe someone was burning leaves down by the river, but then a crackling sound jolted me upright. My heart raced as I stumbled to the window. That's when I saw it, flames wild and angry, tearing through the roof of my main cabin. The orange glow lit the trees like it was already sunrise, though it was barely past 3 in the morning. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a fire. This was my whole life going up in smoke. I ran outside barefoot, the cold dirt biting into my feet. The fire had already spread from the main lodge to the nearest rental cabin, dry timber catching like paper. I yelled for my neighbor, who was already dialing the fire department, but we both knew it was too late. By the time the trucks rumbled up the hill, sirens screaming, the flames were roaring so high that even the firefighters shook their heads. They worked furiously, hoses blasting streams of water, but the fire seemed to laugh at their efforts. One by one, the cabins fell, walls collapsing with a sound that echoed like gunfire in the night. I stood there helpless, smoke stinging my eyes, the heat so strong it forced me back. My hands shook as I watched everything I had built with my own hands. The resort I had spent 10 years turning from an old hunting camp into a peaceful getaway collapse into ash. Families came here every summer to hike, fish, and sit around the campfire under the stars. Kids had caught their first fish in my lake. Couples had celebrated anniversaries in those cabins, and now all of it was gone in less than an hour. When the last flames finally died at dawn, I was left staring at blackened rubble. The air was silent except for the hiss of smoldering wood. The firefighters packed up quietly, their faces heavy with pity. One of them, a tall man with soot on his cheeks, walked over. "I'm sorry, son, this looks intentional." I blinked at him. Intentional. He pointed to a patch of ground near the lodge. "See here, burn patterns like this don't. That happened naturally. Someone used accelerant. Gasoline, most likely." My chest tightened. I already knew who he meant, though I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud 2 weeks earlier. I had sat across from the HOA president, Karen. She was a sharp woman, the type who always wore pressed suits and looked at you like you were beneath her. She had offered me a check for the resort land, smiling as if she were doing me a favor. "We're planning a luxury development," she had said, sliding the paper across the table. "Pools, condos, tennis courts, the whole package. Your cabins are old-fashioned, and frankly, they don't fit our vision." I remember laughing. Old-fashioned. Families love it here, and I'm not selling. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a cold glare. "Think carefully. Opportunities like this don't come twice." I pushed the check back toward her. "I've already thought about it. The answer is no." She stood, straightened her blazer, and leaned down close to my face. "You'll regret this." Now, standing in the ashes, her words echoed in my mind. Regret. Was this what she meant? My neighbor, Mr. Dawson, shuffled over with his hands in his pockets. "I hate to say it, but everyone knows the HOA has been after your land. I wouldn't put it past them." He shook his head, his eyes full of sympathy. "They think they own this whole valley, but this is evil." I nodded slowly, but inside I was boiling. The HOA had wanted control for years. They had sent letters, complained about my guests, even fined me for unauthorized signage when I put up a wooden welcome board by the road. They said my cabins didn't meet neighborhood aesthetic standards, though I had been here long before their subdivision even existed. And now, after I refused their money, my resort was gone. That day I called my insurance company. An inspector came by in the afternoon, clipboard in hand. He walked the property, snapping photos, crouching to look at the charred remains. Finally, he looked up at me and sighed. "This fire wasn't accidental. Someone wanted this place destroyed. But here's the thing, you don't have fire coverage on this level of loss." My head spun. "What do you mean?" "I've paid premiums for years." He tapped his papers. "You're covered for accidental fire, lightning, storm damage, but arson. Unless there's a conviction, the policy won't pay out." I felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath me. Not only had I lost everything, but I wasn't going to get a single dollar to rebuild. That night, I sat on the porch of my ruined house, staring at the ashes. The crickets chirped as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything had. My hands were black with soot, my eyes raw from smoke, and yet one thought kept pulsing in my head. They think they've beaten me. They think they've scared me off my land, but they're wrong. I'm not going anywhere. In the days that followed, people from town came by to offer condolences. Some brought food, others offered tools, a few even slipped me envelopes with small donations. Their kindness kept me going, but I could also see the fear in their eyes. The HOA had power. They controlled permits, codes, and fines. People whispered that crossing them could ruin your life. But whispers don't scare me. I had already lost everything, and that gave me freedom. On the 5th day after the fire, I shaved, put on my cleanest shirt, and walked into the HOA meeting like nothing had happened. The board sat at the front of the room, smug as ever. Karen, which spotted me and raised her eyebrows. "What brings you here?" she asked sweetly. I smiled. "Just taking an interest in community matters," I said, but in my pocket, I clutched a notepad. If they thought burning my resort would silence me, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. That was the night I made a decision. Would stop grieving and start fighting. They had turned my dream into ashes, but ashes can still smolder. And if you blow on them just right, they can spark again, this time into a fire of my own making. One that would burn away every lie the HOA had built. The HOA meeting that night felt like walking into enemy territory. The community hall was brightly lit, but the air was thick with tension. People sat in folding chairs, sipping coffee from paper cups, while the board sat at a long table at the front. Their smiles were polite, their voices rehearsed, but underneath it all, I could feel the arrogance. They spoke like they owned the entire valley, like we were children who needed permission to breathe. Karen, the president, started the meeting with her usual tone, clipped and commanding. "We have a full agenda tonight," she announced. "We'll begin with landscaping updates." She went down a list of minor issues: shrubs by the subdivision entrance, repainting fences, replacing a cracked sidewalk. The audience nodded along half-bored. I sat quietly in the back row watching. My mind wasn't on the flowers or the fences. I was studying them, their body language, the way they spoke, the way they dismissed people's questions with fake politeness. When the floor opened for comments, I stood up. Heads turned, whispers filled the room. Some people looked surprised I had even shown up, standing there with soot still faint on my boots. Karen narrowed her eyes. "Yes," she said, her smile tight. I cleared my throat. I was wondering if the board could make copies of the HOA's financial reports available. You know, budgets, expenses, that sort of thing. I tried to sound casual, like it was just curiosity. The room went quiet for a moment. Karen tilted her head, studying me like a hawk. "Financial reports are presented annually," she said. "But if you'd like, you may file a formal request. Is there a reason you're suddenly interested?" I forced a smile. "Well, I've had some time on my hands since the fire. Just thought I'd understand where our fees go." I let the word fees hang in the air. People in the audience shifted in their seats, some nodding. HOA fees were a sore subject. Everyone paid them, but no one really knew where the money went. Karen's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Very well," she said. "We'll provide last year's budget for review." That was my opening. The next week, a thin packet arrived in my mailbox: HOA financial statements. Neat. And if looking at first glance, everything seemed normal. Income from fees, expenses for landscaping, maintenance, security patrols, but the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. Numbers didn't add up. There were huge miscellaneous expenses with no explanation. Line items like storm drain maintenance appeared 3 times in the same quarter, each costing thousands. And then, near the end, I saw it. A withdrawal of $50,000 labeled contractor services. No contractor name, no invoice, nothing. Just a vanishing pile of money. That night I spread the papers on my kitchen table, circling numbers in red pen. My hands shook, not from fear, but from excitement. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I'd be too broken after the fire to fight back. But if there was one thing I knew, it was this: numbers don't lie. People do. That next HOA meeting, I returned with a folder under my arm. I sat through the boring parts, more talk of lawns and sidewalks, until the end. When they opened the floor, I raised my hand. Karen reluctantly nodded. "I was going over the financials," I said, holding up the packet, "and I noticed some odd charges. For example, 3 separate payments for storm drain maintenance in 1 quarter. Can you explain why that was necessary?" The room stirred. People whispered. Everyone had seen water pooling on the streets whenever it rained. The drains clearly weren't fixed. Karen's jaw tightened. "Those were preventative measures," she said smoothly. "Standard practice." I flipped a page. "Interesting. And what about this $50,000 payment to an unnamed contractor? Who exactly was paid for that?" The whispers grew louder. A man in the front row muttered, "50,000. For what?" Karen cleared her throat. "Those details are confidential," she said. I raised my eyebrows. "Confidential? Isn't this community money?" For the first time, Karen lost her composure. Her smile cracked, and her voice rose slightly. "If you have concerns, you may file them in writing. This meeting is not the place for accusations." I sat down, but I didn't miss the looks exchanged among the neighbors. Doubt had been planted. People began murmuring, shaking their heads. Some looked angry. That was exactly what I wanted. After the meeting, as people filed out, an older man tapped my shoulder. "You're asking the right questions," he whispered. "They've been bleeding us dry for years." He glanced nervously at Karen across the room. "Be careful though. They don't like anyone digging too deep." Then he slipped away. The next day I decided to dig deeper. I went to the county records office, asking for permits and contracts tied to the HOA. The clerk, a friendly woman, pulled out stacks of documents. Hours passed as I flipped through files. And there it was, more discrepancies. Projects that were supposedly paid for but never approved. Contractors listed on forms that didn't exist in the state registry. Even signatures that looked wrong. Forged. Maybe. I started taking notes, filling page after page. Every discovery made my blood boil hotter. These people hadn't just burned my resort, they had been robbing the entire community, hiding behind their shiny meetings and fake smiles. One evening a knock came at my door. It was Mr. Dawson, my neighbor. He looked uneasy. "Heard you were stirring things up," he said. "Listen, I don't want trouble, but you should know they'll come after you. They've got money, lawyers, connections. Folks have tried before, and it never ends well." I poured him a cup of coffee and smiled grimly. Then maybe it's time someone finished what others started. That night, alone at my table, I spread by the papers again. My resort was gone, reduced to ashes, but maybe that fire had lit something stronger inside me. If they thought I'd just disappear, they didn't know me at all. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every neighbor who had written a check and never seen where it went. I was fighting for truth. The first step had, but I've been asking questions. The next step was gathering undeniable proof, and I knew just where to look. The deeper I went into the HOA's numbers, the more the puzzle pieces refused to fit. It was like staring at a picture where half the shapes had been cut to force them in the wrong spots. On paper, everything looked neat. In reality, it reeked of fraud, but numbers alone wouldn't be enough. If I wanted to bring them down, I needed someone who had seen the inside of their dirty dealings, someone who had been part of the machine before stepping away. That's when I remembered Martin Fields. Martin had been the HOA treasurer for years, until he suddenly resigned 6 months back. At the time, Karen spun it as personal reasons, but I'd heard whispers that he quit after a heated argument with the board. If anyone knew where the bodies were buried, it was Martin. I found his address in the county directory and drove out one cloudy afternoon. His house sat on the edge of town, a small brick ranch with an overgrown lawn. He answered the door slowly, wearing a worn flannel shirt and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much. When he recognized me, he frowned. "You're the cabin guy. I'm sorry about what happened to your place." "Thanks," I said quietly. "Can I come in? I need to talk. It's about the HOA." Martin hesitated, glancing up and down the street as though the board might be hiding in the bushes. Finally, he nodded and stepped aside. Inside, his living room was cluttered with books, newspapers, and boxes stacked against the wall. He poured 2 coffees and sat heavily in a chair. "So," he said, staring into his mug, "what do you want to know?" "Everything," I replied, "especially about the money." For a moment, silence hung between us. Then Martin sighed. "I knew they'd push you too far. Karen doesn't take no for an answer. You think your fire was an accident?" My chest tightened. "I already know it wasn't." He nodded grimly. "Figures the HOA has been laundering money for years. Fake maintenance projects, phantom contractors, inflated invoices, you name it. I kept the books clean as long as I could. But when I started asking too many questions, they shut me out. They had meetings without me, moved funds I couldn't track. Finally, Karen cornered me and said, "If you can't follow orders, you can leave," so I left. "Do you have proof?" I asked, leaning forward. He rubbed his temples. "Not much. When I resigned, they wiped my access to the accounts. But I kept copies of some invoices, ones I knew were fake." He stood, walked to a box in the corner, and pulled out a folder stuffed with papers. "Here," he said, dropping it on the table. "Look at this one, $40,000 to Green Valley Maintenance. Sounds legitimate, right? Except Green Valley doesn't exist." I checked. No license, no workers, nothing. I flipped through page after page, contracts signed by names I didn't recognize. Payments authorized without board votes, and charges for work no one had ever seen. It was a goldmine. "This is enough to raise eyebrows," I said, "but we need more. Something that ties the money directly to them, not just fake companies." Martin leaned back, eyes dark. "You want the smoking gun? I don't have it, but I know where to look. Where the HOA slush fund, they keep a separate account under a shell name. That's where the real money moves. Only Karen and the vice president have access." My mind raced. "If I could get that account number," Martin shook his head. "Be careful. They got it like treasure. And if they find out you're digging, you'll be next." I smiled bitterly. "They already burned me out once. I've got nothing left to lose." When I left Martin's house, the folder sat on the passenger seat beside me. I felt like I was carrying dynamite. One wrong move, and it could all explode. But in the pit of my stomach, I also felt hope. For the first time since the fire, I had something solid. The next HOA meeting came a week later. I walked in calmer. This time, though inside, adrenaline surged. The board tried to carry on with business as usual, but the crowd was restless. Neighbors had heard rumors about missing funds after my last questions. Whispers spread faster than wildfire in a small town. When the floor opened, I stood again. "I've been reviewing invoices," I said loudly enough for the whole room, "and I found payments to Green Valley Maintenance. Can anyone here point out where Green Valley operates? Because according to state records, they don't exist." The room erupted in murmurs. People twisted in their chairs, glancing at one another. Karen froze, her smile faltering for the first time. "Those records are proprietary," she snapped. "Proprietary," I shot back. "We pay those bills. That's our money. If a company doesn't exist, then where did the money go?" A woman in the second row raised her hand timidly. "My dues went up this year because of maintenance costs. Are you saying those costs were fake?" Karen banged her gavel, her voice sharp. "This discussion is over." But it wasn't. The room had turned. People were whispering angrily now, demanding answers. The board quickly adjourned and filed out, faces stiff, but I could see the cracks forming. The neighbors no longer trusted them blindly. And once doubt takes root, it grows fast. That night, as I packed away the papers Martin gave me, I realized I was being watched. Across the road, a dark SUV idled with its lights off. My skin prickled. I stepped onto the porch, and the engine roared to life, tires crunching on gravel as it sped away. A warning, no doubt. They knew I was getting closer instead of scaring me. It fueled me. I doubled my efforts, digging through public databases, property records, even old HOA newsletters. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. The missing money wasn't vanishing, it was being funneled. I just didn't know where. Then, late one night, Martin called. His voice was low, urgent. I shouldn't even be saying this, but check, under the name Clearwater Development. It's the shell account. They used it while I was still treasurer. It'll lead you to the slush fund. I thanked him, hung up, and immediately started searching. Sure enough, Clearwater Development wasn't a real business. It was a shell tied to a P.O. box in town. And when I traced it through county filings, I found something that made my blood run cold. The same account had received large deposits. Just days before my resort burned down, I sat there staring at the screen, my fists clenched. It was them. The HOA didn't just steal money, they used it to pay for the fire that destroyed my cabins. They had turned community dues into fuel for us. The weight of that truth pressed down on me. This wasn't just about fraud anymore. This was criminal. This was dangerous. And if I wanted justice, I couldn't fight it alone. It was time to take this evidence to someone who had the power to act. I gathered Martin's folder, my notes, and the Clearwater records into one thick binder. The next morning I drove straight to the county auditor's office. My heart pounded as I handed the binder over to a stern-faced investigator. She flipped through the papers, her brow furrowing deeper with each page. Finally, she looked up. "This isn't just sloppy bookkeeping," she said. "This is fraud, embezzlement, and possibly racketeering. And if what you're saying about the fire is true," she shook her head, "we'll need to involve law enforcement." For the first time since the flames consumed my cabins, I felt a surge of something. I thought I'd lost hope. They had tried to break me, but instead they'd lit the fire that would burn their empire down. And as I left the office, watching the morning sun climb over the hills, I knew this was just the beginning. The drive back from the county auditor's office was strangely quiet, almost too quiet for the storm that was brewing. For weeks I had been consumed by anger and grief, but now, sitting behind the wheel with the binder no longer in my possession, I felt something different. Anticipation. I had finally passed the torch to people with the power to act, but the road to justice is never quick. I knew the HOA wouldn't go down without a fight, and until the authorities were ready, I had to keep playing the part of the nosy neighbor, gathering what I could while pretending I hadn't already lit the fuse. Over the next several weeks, investigators came and went discreetly. 2 plainclothed auditors visited my property, quietly taking notes as we walked the charred remains of my cabins. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes, crouched near the blackened earth and scraped a sample into a vial. "Excellent," she murmured, almost to herself. They didn't tell me much, but their silence said enough. This wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. Meanwhile, I kept attending HOA meetings. Each one was more tense than the last. The board sat stiffer, their smiles thinner, their patience shorter. Karen, who once spoke like a queen among peasants, now snapped at even small questions. I watched her carefully, noting the sweat on her forehead, the way her hands clenched the gavel just a little too tightly. One evening, as I left a meeting, a neighbor hurried to catch up with me. Her name was Linda, a mother of 3 who'd lived in the community for years. She looked around nervously before speaking. "They're hiding something," she whispered. "I work part-time at the local bank. I've seen transactions, big ones, moving through accounts that don't match any normal business. Clearwater Development. Does that mean anything to you?" I stopped dead in my tracks. "Yes," I said slowly. "It means everything." Her eyes widened at my response, but before she could ask more, A board member's car pulled into the lot, and she quickly excused herself. I walked away with my heart pounding. Piece by piece, the puzzle was snapping into place, and now others were starting to notice too. The HOA's control was slipping. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the investigator I'd met at the auditor's office. Her tone was serious but steady. "We've reviewed the documents you provided. Combined with additional records we've obtained, we believe there is substantial evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. And regarding your file, we've found payments tied to contractors with criminal records linked directly to Clearwater Development. We're coordinating with federal authorities. You should prepare yourself. Things are going to move quickly." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. For months I had dreamed of this moment, the day when justice would finally corner them, and now it was here. The next HOA meeting would be the last. The community hall was unusually crowded that night. Word had spread about the missing money, the fake companies, the unanswered questions. People who normally skipped meetings showed up in force, their eyes hard with suspicion. The board sat at the front, stiff and defensive. Karen tried to start the meeting with her usual authority, but the crowd wasn't in the mood for niceties. "Where's our money, Karen?" someone shouted from the back. "Why did fees go up if you've been paying ghost companies?" another demanded. Karen slammed the gavel down. "Order," she barked. "These are baseless accusations. We will not tolerate." She was cut off by the sound of doors opening at the back of the hall. Everyone turned. A line of men and women in dark jackets stepped inside, badges flashing under the fluorescent lights. Federal agents. The room fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. "Karen Myers," the lead agent said firmly, stepping forward. "And members of this board, you are under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and suspected arson. Please remain seated." Chaos erupted. Neighbors gasped, some clapping, others shouting in shock. Karen shot to her feet, her face pale as paper. "This is outrageous," she screamed. "You can't do this. We are the board. We run this community." The agent didn't flinch. "Not anymore." He nodded, and officers moved in. One by one, the board members were placed in handcuffs. Papers and laptops were seized from the table. Phones were taken from pockets. The entire room watched, frozen, as the rulers of the HOA were marched out like common criminals. Karen's eyes locked on mine as she passed, fury and fear battling in her expression. For months, she had treated me like a nuisance, someone to crush under her heel. But now, she looked at me with something new to feed. The meeting dissolved into shouting and disbelief. Neighbors crowded around me, some thanking me, others peppering me with questions. I didn't answer much. I just stood there, letting the scene sink in. The empire they had built on lies and intimidation had crumbled in a single night. But the fight wasn't over. The following weeks were a blur of news coverage and legal proceedings. Headlines splashed across local papers. HOA board arrested in fraud and arson scandal. Reporters showed footage of the board members being led into court in orange jumpsuits. Community members lined up to give statements, each one more damning than the last. I was called to testify, not just about the fire but about the financial trail I had uncovered. Sitting on the witness stand, I spoke clearly, every word carrying the weight of months of pain and persistence. I told the jury about the false invoices, the shell accounts, the threats, the night my cabins burned. I watched as the evidence piled up against them, crushing any hope of escape, and when the verdict came guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Justice had been served. But justice, I realized, wasn't just about punishing them. It was about rebuilding. One morning, months after the trial, I stood once again on my land. The ashes had long been cleared, the ground leveled. Construction crews bustled around me, raising new cabins from fresh timber. The smell of cut wood filled the air, mingling with the crisp scent of pine. It was the smell of renewal, of hope. Neighbors stopped by often now, not out of pity but out of genuine support. Some offered to invest in the new resort. Others volunteered their time. Even the county pitched in, eager to see something positive rise from the wreckage. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight lifting. As I watched the walls of the first cabin rise, I thought about Karen's face as the agents led her away. Pale, shocked, broken. She had tried to burn me down, but in the end, she burned herself. Her greed had destroyed her, while my determination had rebuilt me. That night, I sat on my porch, looking out at the construction lights glowing against the dark hills. The stars glittered above, the same stars that once shone over campfires and laughter. Soon families would return, kids would splash in the lake, and the sound of joy would echo through the valley again. The HOA had thought they held all the power, but power built on lies is fragile. Truth had broken them, and I knew, deep in my bones, that no fire, no matter how hot, could ever destroy that. The morning of the trial felt strange, as if the air itself was heavier than usual. My boots crunched against the gravel outside the courthouse, each step reminding me of the weight of what I was about to face. Months of digging through records, collecting evidence, and watching neighbors who once cheered the HOA slowly turn against them, all of it had led to this day. The courthouse loomed tall, its stone walls carrying a sense of permanence, like it had seen hundreds of stories like mine. But today it was my story being judged. I paused at the steps, looking up at the old clock mounted high above the doors. It ticked steadily, indifferent to my nerves. I wasn't just here for myself anymore. I was here for every person they had bullied, every dollar they had stolen, and every dream they had tried to burn to the ground, literally in my case. Inside, the hallways echoed with hurried footsteps, whispers, and the shuffling of papers. Reporters clustered near the entrance to the courtroom, cameras flashing as they caught sight of Karen and the other board members being led in by their lawyers. They didn't strut this time. Their expensive suits looked stiff, their faces pale. Their arrogance melted into something that resembled fear. I couldn't help but notice how different they appeared compared to those nights in the HOA meetings when they towered over residents, barking rules and threats like kings and queens. Now they were just defendants, no different from criminals, lined up in a courtroom. As I took my seat behind my lawyer, I noticed a few of my neighbors sitting in the gallery. Some gave me nods of support. Others looked ashamed, realizing they had once trusted the very people who burned my resort to the ground. The prosecutor, a calm but fierce woman named Sarah, adjusted her files at the front of the courtroom. I trusted her. She had spent hours going through the budget documents I'd uncovered, building a case so airtight that even Karen's expensive lawyers couldn't poke holes in it. The trial began, and the judge's gavel echoed like thunder. The charges were read aloud: fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, conspiracy, and arson. Each word felt like a stone being laid into the foundation of justice. Karen kept her eyes forward, her lips pressed into a thin line, but I could see her hands trembling. The evidence came next. Sarah methodically presented the HOA's financial records, pointing out missing funds, fake invoices, and massive transfers labeled as maintenance that had never occurred. The jury leaned in closer as charts and diagrams flashed on the screen. My stomach churned when the photographs of my burned resort were shown. Flames against the night sky, blackened remains, the place I had built with my hands forever lost. Then came the testimony. The former treasurer I had met, Mark, was called to the stand. His voice was shaky at first, but as he spoke, his confidence grew. He explained how Karen and the board had pressured him to sign off on fake expenses and how he finally quit when he realized their greed had no limits. He looked directly at the jury as he said, they wanted his land. When he refused, they made sure he paid the price. His words hung in the air like a hammer. Karen shifted uncomfortably, her lawyer scribbling notes furiously, but the damage was done. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and walked to the stand. The eyes of the courtroom followed me, but I forced myself to focus only on the truth. I told them about the threats Karen had made, the night of the fire, the smell of accelerant the inspector had pointed out, and the sleepless weeks spent poring over documents until I found the trail of corruption. I described the betrayal I felt when I realized my own neighbor's money had been stolen by the very people who claimed to protect the community. My voice shook at times, especially when I recalled watching my cabins burn, but I didn't stop. I ended my testimony with one simple sentence. They thought they could destroy me, but all they did was expose themselves. The defense tried to paint me as bitter, suggesting I was exaggerating because I had lost everything in the fire. But every piece of paper, every signature, every dollar stolen spoke louder than their excuses. The jury wasn't buying it. You could see it in their eyes. The walls Karen had built around her lies were crumbling with every hour that passed. The trial stretched on for days, but the outcome became clearer with each witness, each document, and each fact laid bare. Finally, after closing arguments, the jury left to deliberate. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating as we waited. Minutes felt like hours. I stared at the polished wooden floor, my hands clenched tightly together. This wasn't just about winning, it was about proving that truth mattered, that no amount of power or money could erase what they had done. When the jury returned, the foreman's voice was steady. We find the defendants guilty on all counts. The words exploded in my chest like fireworks. Relief, justice, and vindication all at once. Karen's face drained of color, her lips parting in shock. One board member buried his face in his hands. Another shook his head as if refusing to believe it. The judge's gavel struck again, sentencing them to years in prison and ordering full restitution, including funds to cover the damages caused by the fire. The HOA that had once terrorized the neighborhood was finished. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed me with microphones and cameras. "How do you feel?" they asked, shoving questions in my direction. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Justice was served," I said. "They thought they could take everything from me, but in the end, the truth took everything from them." The cameras flashed again, but I didn't care about the headlines. All I cared about was what came next. Months later, the land looked different. Where blackened ruins once stood, new cabins rose, their fresh wood gleaming in the sunlight. The hammering of nails and the smell of sawdust filled the air as workers rebuilt my dream. This time, it wasn't just a resort, it was a symbol of survival. Families began booking cabins again. Children laughed in the forest. and the sound of life returned to the place the HOA had tried to erase. My neighbors visited too, some apologizing for ever trusting the HOA, others thanking me for standing up when no one else dared to. I accepted their words but never forgot the cost. One evening, as I stood on the porch of the first rebuilt cabin, watching the sun dip behind the trees, I finally let out a long breath I felt I had been holding for months. The fire had nearly broken me, but in the ashes, I had found something stronger, the courage to fight back. The HOA had underestimated me, thinking they could bully and intimidate me into silence. Instead, they had shown me that the truth, once uncovered, could not be stopped. As the first guests arrived for their stay, I welcomed them with a smile, the sound of children's laughter already drifting through the woods. Life had come full circle. My resort was alive again, and the shadows of the HOA were nothing more than a memory. Justice had been done, and though scars remained, I knew one thing for certain: they could burn wood and stone, but they could never burn resilience, never silence truth, and never win against someone who refused to give up. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful real-life tales like this, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube.